Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the massive Russian military buildup surrounding Ukraine in preparation for what looks like a planned knockout blow to defeat the Ukrainian military and topple the government. With Putin already one chess move ahead by putting his nuclear forces on the highest alert and deploying his mobile missiles, the signal is clear to Biden and NATO, not that their military options are good and that they are likely to come to Ukraine's defense in any meaningful way. Dr. Pavel Felgenhauer, a Moscow-based defense analyst, columnist, and journalist with Novaya Gazeta, joins us to discuss the likelihood that Putin will try to topple the Ukrainian government once the ground is dry enough for an armored assault in the northeast, in concert with a landing assault on the Black Sea, to quickly defeat the Ukrainian military and install a pro-Russian government in Kiev, leaving a landlocked rump state in the west to fend for itself. With Secretary of State Blinken warning Russia today that, quote, if it acts recklessly or aggressively, there will be costs, there will be consequences, the silence from the U.S. on Russia's belligerent brinksmanship speaks volumes. Then, with the death of Prince Philip and a week of mourning underway in the UK until his burial next Saturday, we will speak with Adam Ramsey, the editor of Open Democracy and a member of the Scottish Green Party, whose latest article at Open Democracy is Prince Philip was the godfather of Anglo-British nationalism. He joins us to discuss how it was the Queen's husband who first suggested televising her coronation, which has led to the tripod upon which Anglo-British nationalism rests: TV, the tabloids, and the monarchy. Then finally, we'll assess the election results from the efforts by the Retail, Wholesale and Department Store Union to unionize an Amazon warehouse in Alabama, which lost in a vote of 738 in favor to 1,798 against. Mike Elk, senior labor reporter and founder of the Payday Report, who was senior labor reporter at Politico and spent years covering union organizing in the South for The Guardian, joins us to discuss his latest article at Payday Report, Anti-Union Amazon Workers Explain How Mandatory Anti-Union Meetings Turned Them Against the RWDSU. And joining us now from Moscow is Dr. Pavel Felgenhauer, a Moscow-based defense analyst, columnist, and journalist who previously served as a senior research officer in the Soviet Academy of Sciences and published a regular column on defense in the English-language local daily, The Moscow Times, and for more than 6 years as an independent defense analyst, and now he is on the staff of Novaya Gazeta, and his regular commentary on Russia appears in many other local and international publications. Welcome to Background Briefing, Dr. Pavel Felgenhauer.
Hi, nice to have you.
It's good to talk to you again, Pavel. And the United States Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, was on the Sunday morning talk shows today here in the United States, saying, as we speak right now, I have to tell you, I have real concerns about Russia's actions on the borders of Ukraine. There are more Russian forces massed on those borders than at any time since 2014, when Russia first invaded. That's why we're in very close contact, in close coordination with our allies and partners in Europe. And he went on to say President Biden's been very clear about this. If Russia acts recklessly or aggressively, there will be costs, there will be consequences. So what is going on with these troop movements on the border, Russia's border with Ukraine in the east and Crimea in the south? I mean, I'm not sure what the U.S. and NATO response would be, but do you have any sense of what Putin's motives are here?
Well, what's happening right now is much bigger than Ukraine and the border with Ukraine. The concentration of troops on the border of Ukraine, first of all, there are troops there all the time, kind of backing up the Russian-supported separatists in the Donbass. But the build-up and the mobilization of forces and forward deployment of forces of the South Military District, the Black Sea Fleet, and the Caspian Flotilla, it basically began already in March. What followed in April, more or less last week, is a total mobilization of the entire Russian military machine from Alaska to the Baltics, including the Russian strategic nuclear deterrent, who's right now on the topmost state of readiness, or at least that was and it's officially announced. This mobilization is happening in a demonstrative mode. The Russians are not much trying to mask or cover up the movement of troops. Russian strategic nuclear ICBMs, the mobile ones, have been moved out of hangars and into the field where they should be during a nuclear war, ready to shoot at the United States, in a way that the Americans would see using their satellites. So these are demonstrative moves. Russia is demonstrating its readiness to military action, and not only over Ukraine, but if the United States, as it has apparently said, would stand side by side with Ukraine if they are attacked, then Russia could take on the United States, including in a nuclear war. So this is nuclear brinkmanship at its kind of classical ways. But that does not mean that war is happening right now immediately. It's going to be right now anyways. It's going to take time. But the problem is that the military are on the move. There's a massive movement of Russian forces out of Siberia and the Urals, the central military district, to deployments in Voronezh and Belgorod and Bryansk. That's north of the Donbass. Apparently, Russia is again getting ready and preparing troops and possibilities for a very deep operation in Ukraine, maybe also involving a large landing operation somewhere maybe between Odessa and Nikolaev. So that's, and at the same time preparing its entire forces and all its military districts are in full mobilization mode, and the North Sea Fleet, which is a separate strategic unit on the level of a military district. It's 4 military districts plus the North Sea Fleet and the nuclear deterrent. Everything is in full battle readiness.
So this means that Russia is essentially surrounding Ukraine. It's got a heavy military presence on the northeast. It's got, and it goes all the way around through the Donbass, down across the border with Crimea, Russia-occupied Crimea, and then all the way to the west along the coast of Ukraine, where they could do military landing. So what you're saying is that Ukraine could be attacked from many directions, if not from almost, all directions except from Belarus and from the west.
Well, if Russia goes into action, I believe the Russian General Staff is planning a so-called deep strategic operation to swiftly and decisively defeat Ukraine militarily, surround in a strategic kind of Stalingrad type operation the Ukrainian forces that are deployed in the Donbass, defeat them and take them prisoner, topple the government in Kiev, which will fall if there's such a decisive victory. So Russia is going for a kind of blitzkrieg type operation, a long, prolonged, kind of bloody, slow operation in the Donbass to push the Ukrainians back. I don't think that that's on the cards. Of course, again, it's not clear will the final go-ahead be given. It's the military tools are being readied. There has been the exact number of Russian troops that are being mobilized right now and moved out of garrisons into the field is not being reported, but on the central military district, their local press service said that 70,000 troops are involved. And the central military district troops are being reported from the Ukrainian border. The central military district is the main reserve military district. It's in the middle of Russia, and it's right now being moved west. The others are military districts apparently are mostly holding ground, but there is a report from the 21st of March by the British that 3 Russian large assault landing ships moved through the channel south, steaming together, escorted by 1 corvette. And the British Royal Navy believes they have tanks and Marines on board. So Russia is gathering up to maybe 25 different landing craft in the Black Sea, those of the Black Sea, these from the Baltics, also landing ships up to 10. Landing and artillery support ships from the Caspian Sea are being moved through the Volga-Don Channel and the Don and Sea of Azov into the Black Sea. So we're talking about up to 25 assault landing ships of different classes, and support ships maybe up to 50 all in all. And that's too much for just some kind of tactical landing just north of the Perikop from Crimea. That's something bigger being prepared. So it would be a deep, swift operation. That's what Russia would be going for if it goes. But right now, it's not really time for that. It's too early. It's the Rasputitsa, the spring Rasputitsa, that's a sea of mud, and what's worse, the creeks and rivers in the Ukrainian Levoberezhye, the left part of Ukraine, left or east of the Dnieper, they're overflowing from the melting snow. Crossing them would be a problem, so right now everything waits till the dirt roads and the fields dry up, the level of these rivers and creeks falls. So we're talking about mid-May, something, most likely, the most obvious time, when additional troops could be moved from the Western Military District. The 1st Guards Tank Army is also being mobilized, but a lot of its elements will be used, say, for the Victory Parade on May the 9th in Moscow and other cities, so most likely after that. Of course, there's a possibility that nothing will happen, that this is a brinkmanship, this is a military threats, that will, if Ukraine may some kind, or may not, or maybe they'll do some kind of compromise or really accept what Russia is demanding. But the thing is, if Russia begins to move back what it moved forward, to return the units back to Siberia and the Urals, and then, of course, begin demobilizing. And right now, that would mean up to 130,000 conscripts that have finished their 1-year service will have to be sent home. There they were, but were well trained. But now, the most likely, their demobilization has been postponed since they were moved out from permanent garrisons into the field. But they'll have to be demobilized. They'll be replaced by new ones. So Russia, it will take time, maybe to return to the as it was before in March. And then get into the capability to do another mobilization and move back again. That can happen maybe in end of August, September. So if Russia does not go right now, that's a big deal. Mm-hmm. And decides to demobilize and stand down. That's a big deal. It can't be reversed.
I see. So
it's not an Uber which you can call and then say you're not taking it and then call it back again. This is a big deal. Either you go, or you lose the capability to go for several months. Or it's going to be a big problem because battle readiness is going to decrease temporarily.
So obviously, because of the weather and the mud and the slush and the snow, it's more likely they'll wait till the ground dries.
Oh, the snow is almost it's right now finally fully melting, but there's too much water in the rivers and creeks that you have to cross if you're going a pincer tank movement from the north to the south west in Ukraine. So better wait for the level of water to fall to go over those creeks much more easily.
Right, but it sounds like Putin is a couple of chess moves ahead here. He's already got his full nuclear forces on high alert, which definitely signals to the United States that they're ready for the American reaction.
Worst case scenario, yes.
Yeah, they're ready for
That's what the Kremlin says. We're ready for the worst case scenario with America.
Right, so that's incredibly scary. I don't understand why. Maybe they could do a knockout blow and knock out the Ukrainian military and get rid of the government in one fell swoop. But they can't occupy the country, can they? I mean, wouldn't that lead to guerrilla war?
Well, the Russian President Putin and the Russian elite believe that the Ukrainian nation does not exist, and the Ukrainian national state is an abomination, invented by anti-Russian forces, by the Austrians to begin with. I mean, the Austro-Hungarian Empire that controlled Galicia and Lviv for almost over 100 years, 19th century, and then by the Germans, the Poles, the Americans. That these are Russians. Putin said many times, repeated, that Russians and Ukrainians are one folk, one nation, and that they should live in one state. So the liquidation of the Ukrainian state and the non-existent Ukrainian nation is a major priority for Russia, a long-term priority. Russia is ready to live with kind of friendly Ukrainian state that is a Russian protectorate, but absolutely not with the Ukraine that's going to the West, which wants to join NATO, wants to join the European Union. That's an abomination that should be destroyed by all means. So the Russian officials right now say that if there's going to be a war, that will be the destruction of the Ukrainian state as we know it. So the stakes are actually very high. Most likely, Russia does not have any ambition of taking over the entire Ukraine. But a big chunk of it, most likely, yes. And with this big concentration of sea landing power in the Black Sea, maybe there's an idea that Russia could liberate Odessa and Nikolaev and Kherson and make Ukraine a landlocked country, the rump Ukraine, which would make it economically totally inviable. This whole real crisis began after and Russia began to mobilize forces after on the 2nd of February this year, the Ukrainians closed down took off air three pro-Russian Ukrainian TV stations associated with the Ukrainian pro-Russian party opposition bloc.
Right.
And also indicted its leader, Viktor Medvedchuk, who's a personal friend of Putin. There are pro-Russian forces in Ukraine, and this party is represented in parliament, and it's the biggest right now opposition bloc in parliament. So when Russia says that the conflict in Ukraine is a civil conflict between Ukrainians, well, there is a point there. There are pro-Russian forces. So Russia was ready to see, like right now, when Ukraine is in economic and political turmoil, as it often is, that the pro-Russian forces would be gaining ground, maybe getting into government, maybe into some government coalition in the future. But when the Ukrainian government began in February to take them down, that was seen as a totally unacceptable move. And Russia began resorting to the military options. So I would believe that if any kind of peaceful resolution of the present standoff may happen, that would involve the reinstatement of these Russian TV stations or pro-Russian TV stations, dropping of the case against Medvedchuk, and that would be Russian minimum demands. Because, and of course, Russia would want very strong assurances of Ukraine not going to NATO or European Union, and right now Ukraine is again repeating that only NATO can defend it, which is most likely true to some extent. But for Russia, for Moscow, that's a red rag.
Sure. Well, this is a frightening analysis you've given us, and let's revisit this soon. I thank you so much for joining us here today, Dr. Pavel Felgenhauer.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Dr. Pavel Felgenhauer, a Moscow-based defense analyst, columnist, and journalist. He previously served as a senior research officer in the Soviet Academy of Sciences and published a regular column on defense in the English-language local daily, The Moscow Times. And after that, for more than 6 years, he was an independent defense analyst, and he's now on the staff of Novoye Gazeta. And his regular commentary on Russia appears in many other local international publications. And he joined us from Moscow. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into the week of mourning underway until the burial of Prince Philip next Saturday. And we'll discuss the tripod upon which Anglo-British nationalism rests: TV, the tabloids, and the monarchy.
Hey, rejuvenation, the second wind. When will it begin? Repatriation, what is my sin? When will my ship come in? First as the pub saps your body, and the church will snatch your money. The queen is dead, boys, and it's so lonely on a limb. As the pub that wrecks your body, and the church, all they want is your money. The queen is dead, boys, and it's so lonely on a limb.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Adam Ramsey, who's the editor of Open Democracy, a member of the Scottish Green Party. He sits on the board of Voices for Scotland and the advisory committees for the Economic Change Unit and the journal Soundings. And his latest article at Open Democracy is Prince Philip was the godfather of Anglo-British nationalism. Welcome to Background Briefing, Adam Ramsey.
Having me. Thank you for having me.
So the UK is about to go through a whole week of mourning all the way through till next Saturday, when the funeral for Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, will be held at the St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. How much of the country is going to be shut down? I guess businesses and sports venues have been given the option of continuing. The government itself is pretty much shut down, although I'm not sure people would notice it, given that you in the UK have your ridiculous version of Donald Trump.
I mean, what we're seeing really is a sort of desperate attempt by a lot of the kind of ruling class in Britain to enforce a kind of mourning on the country. So one of the things that's been fascinating to watch in the last couple of days, this weekend, has been viewing figures of the BBC, for example, have plummeted compared to previous weeks, because every single BBC channel has been wall-to-wall mourning for Prince Philip. And I think most people in the country look at that and, you know, he was a 99-year-old man. Of course, every death is a tragedy, but no more so than people's grandparents who died in the pandemic and so on. And there's this kind of very strong attempt by particular bits of the media, by the sort of national official media in a sense, to reconstruct this sort of Anglo-British idea through the death of Prince Philip. And I think you only really understand that when you see that in the context of what else is happening in the country. So we've got riots taking place in Northern Ireland at the moment because the people in Northern Ireland who want to stay as part of the UK have suddenly realised that Brexit probably means that they're likely to move towards United Ireland. We've got an election coming up where I am in Scotland, which is very likely to deliver a majority for pro-independence parties, the SNP and the Greens, which means we're quite likely to see a kind of another push for an independence referendum. Polls show it's likely to be a yes vote. And so the kind of forces of the Union, which have the monarchy at their centre, are trying to use the death of Prince Philip to sort of reinforce a sense of Britishness, which they conjured up after World War II, which Philip himself played a key role in conjuring up. And that kind of seems to be failing. The fact that people are switching off their TVs as the BBC does this tells you something quite powerful.
Well, your article makes this really very powerful point that Prince Philip, of course, was born in 1922 at the height of the British Empire, and that since then the British monarchy has transitioned from the divine, I'm quoting from the article, from the divine rulers at the apex of history's biggest empire to the celebrities at the centre of a modern nationalist project built on TV and tabloids. And it was, of course, Prince Philip back in 1953 who recommended that the Queen's coronation be televised, and that ended up with it being the most watched TV show in history at that time. So let's talk about this tripod that you talk about in your article that props up the monarchy: TV, tabloids, and the monarchy.
So I think it's important to remember that the idea of Britain as a country which exists in an archipelago in the North Atlantic, rather than as the world's biggest empire in the world ever, is a very modern invention. It was invented kind of after World War II through the late 1940s and early 1950s. When suddenly the British ruling class had to come to terms with the fact that they'd lost India, they'd lost control of a huge chunk of the world, and they were emerging as this new thing. And there's lots of ways that happen, things like the foundation of the NHS, lots of positive things kind of constructed this new idea of what Britain was. But the nationalism at the core of it absolutely was kind of held up, as I say in the article, by this tripod, one part of which was the royal family. And then that kind of intention, as a kind of soap opera that's followed by the tabloid press and the TV. And of course, every modern nation is an imagined community that's convened by its media. That's kind of a truism. Every nationalism is produced by the stories, by the audiences of particular media outlets, and grew up, from the invention of the printing press onwards. And modern nation states are similarly convened by their media and the stories they tell and the myths they construct about their national stories. And in Britain, the central myth is, the royal family, which of course isn't just a sort of symbolic family. It's what gives legitimacy to the state. Britain, doesn't have a sovereignty model where sovereignty lies with the people like it does in any kind of normal democratic country. In theory, in Britain, sovereignty lies with this weird kind of confection called the Crown in Parliament. So, the legitimacy for the whole British state is kind of conferred in part through the monarchy. And the monarchy managed to retain its legitimacy as it entered the late 20th and then the 21st century through this kind of soap opera, followed very closely by the press, this sense that they are the central family in this national family. And when you see people who do grieve a lot for Prince Philip, and of course they exist, there is this large audience still for this soap opera, and they, people who say they feel like they've lost their own grandfather or whatever, and that sense of belonging to this larger national family was constructed by the media and particularly the TV. And as I say in the article, Prince Philip himself played a vital role in that when he persuaded the rest of the family that the Queen's coronation in 1953 should be televised, which had 20 million viewers at the time. It was seen as the day not only that the Queen was crowned, but that TV came to life as well. It led to so many TV sales in the UK that it was the first time that a TV show had more views than a radio show. The other thing I point out in the article is that Philip was born in 1921. The first demonstration of the television was 1922. So in TV is a medium younger than him, and he learned how to use it in order to build this national audience for the kind of royal soap opera.
And again, I'm speaking with Adam Ramsey, the editor of Open Democracy and a member of the Scottish Green Party, and he sits on the board of the Voices of Scotland and the advisory committees for the Economic Change Unit and the journal Soundings. And his latest article at Open Democracy is Prince Philip was the godfather of Anglo-British nationalism. So, of course, now we learn that Prince Harry is coming to the funeral without his wife, who is pregnant, and that there'll be healing within the family. But in terms of using the tabloids and the media, which the royal family have perfected, and I remember years ago when I lived in the UK, I think it was one of the first documentaries about the royal family and, you know, how they live, and it was painfully boring going up in Scotland and shooting deer and sort of sitting around. And a lot of that was in that really quite interesting TV show, The Crown, on Netflix. But it was presented in such a way, well, you know, this is not really what the royals really want to do, but they're sort of forced to do it to show that they have a common touch. And of course, that is fraudulent, right? I mean, they know how to work the tabloids. And the irony is, of course, is that Princess Diana and now Harry and Meghan have turned the tables on them.
Yeah, I mean, Princess Diana is a vital figure in this story because she's the person who really teaches them to use what was then the kind of newly changing modern media of the 90s. If you think that, you know, in the 90s, you get, you know, CNN in the States is the first rolling TV news channel, and the kind of pace of news picks up in a sense, you know, we start to have rolling news. And Diana was the first royal to really understand that. And in a sense, you know, the first kind of major celebrity populist of the royal family, and an early kind of celebrity populist of that era in general. Trump was obsessed with her, absolutely obsessed with her, to the point of almost kind of stalking her, and learned a lot from her in that way. And of course, she was ultimately killed by those forces in a very literal sense. You know, she was chased through the tunnel by the same kind of media whirlwind that the royal family had unleashed. And that, you know, kind of shows the tension there's always been between those forces that's held together this national story. But it, you know, it continued, and I think what's happened with Harry and Meghan rather, is that, you know, those forces have got a lot weaker because of the arrival of social media. So, you know, where the tabloid press is seen by a younger generation as largely racist, you know, that kind of national story that they constructed from the 50s onwards is seen as really not reflecting the modern world, and you know, doesn't ask the kinds of questions around national identity and particularly Britain's racist history that it needs to. Because if you do ask those questions, you begin to unpick the whole thing very rapidly. You know, that Britain was built on kind of fairly violent imperial plunder. And Harry and Meghan, you know, as a result, they've in a sense made the next leap, which is you know, I'd see them as sort of the royal family of Instagram. They've joined that world of sort of Instagram influencers that's more transatlantic. It's not as tied to, you know, this archipelago. They're not kind of caught in this sort of, you know, what I would call a kind of Brexit island. They've escaped that, and they've escaped the tabloids through, in a sense, you know, turning themselves into a more modern kind of celebrity, which is, you know, able to secure its access to public life through its own direct communication with its audience.
Well, in your article, you write, if modern nations are imagined communities convened by the media and feudal states were family affairs, then the new relationship he, meaning Prince Philip, arranged fused the one with the other, giving birth to the gaudy heritage of Churchillism, imperial revisionism, Thatcherism, and most recently Brexit. Could you also add Donald Trump and Boris Johnson to that list?
You could certainly add Boris Johnson. I mean, obviously, Donald, you know, America has gone through a similar process, and my colleague Anthony Barnett wrote a book about this called The Lure of Greatness, about the, you know, comparing Brexit and Trump and talking about the relationship between those processes. And of course, they're intertwined. You know, Britain and America have close relationships, but there is a specifically British phenomenon. You know, Britain has this kind of obsession with continuity that comes from the kind of royal and aristocratic idea of bloodline heritage. You know, that the oldest son always inherits, and so on. That legitimacy comes from inheritance. You know, that's the ultimate message of the monarchy, of course. You know, that But the reason they have the right to govern, to rule, is that they are, their father and their father and their father and their father did, and so on, and it goes back forever. And so they claim. Of course, the actual lineage of the royal family isn't quite like that, but they don't like you to talk about that. And so, could you talk about America in those terms? Not exactly. Obviously, Trumpism is a very much aligned phenomenon. But Boris Johnson, absolutely. You think about why is it that a figure like Boris Johnson is seen by that world of Anglo-British nationalism as a very obvious candidate for prime minister. They describe him, they use the term in Britain, prime ministerial. And people from outside Britain look at him and they think he looks like a buffoon, because that's really what he is. But the reason that through the British lens, someone like Boris Johnson looks like an appropriate person to govern us is that he comes from that old kind of posh ruling class in Britain. And the kind of central message of British nationalism, with the royal family at its helm, is that posh people who inherited their kind of privilege ultimately should be in charge. They should be ruling us. And that's why Britain's had more prime ministers who went to Eton, the posh private school, than have been to state school at all in its history. Because the kind of central mythology is that it's people, it's the old ruling class of the empire, the old aristocrats, ought to be in charge. They're naturally better at running the country. And so someone like Boris Johnson, who to British people is very obviously from that class, is seen as prime ministerial, even though by any qualification he very clearly isn't.
Well, you mentioned in your article, Adam Ramsey, the Netflix show The Crown, which I mentioned earlier, and how people watching The Crown are able to access a less propagandized version of their history than the British press presents. Obviously, in some earlier episodes, you saw the treachery that went on within the royal family in the build-up to World War II and during World War II, with the Queen's uncle being quite sympathetic to Hitler. In fact, my understanding is that even when he was in exile down in Portugal, before they moved him to Bermuda, he was in touch with the Nazis, and there was even some consideration on the part of MI6 to do away with him. I'm not sure about that, but that's what I'd heard. So there was some real ugly stuff that came out there. And then, of course, you had the clash in the more recent episodes between the Queen and Margaret Thatcher. As much as the Queen's husband, or late husband, Prince Philip, was given to sort of colonial racist kind of jokes, was the Queen a little more politically evolved if she really did bridle at Thatcher's support, for example, for apartheid? And I understand that there was a genuine friendship between Queen Elizabeth and Nelson Mandela.
I think that, we can't know what's in the mind of figures like the Queen and like Prince Philip. And in a sense, I don't find it particularly historically useful to try and speculate about that. The Crown represents, on the one hand, a kind of, much more critical story about the monarchy than you ever get from the British press. The BBC could not produce a show like The Crown that asked the same questions as the monarchy. And also at the same time, it is a fictionalized account. I can well believe that the Queen was against apartheid, but I don't know. And I think what we can say, though, is that what the if you think about the ultimate ceremonial role of the British monarchy and the Queen herself since 1953, what that transition has represented, from the beginning of her reign in 1953 to, we're now approaching the end of it. Obviously, we don't know when she'll die, but at some point in the next, decade or two, next decade, she's likely to die. And that represents, the transition of Britain from an empire to a nation state. And it's a very, very violent period of British history. It's a period in which Britain put 500,000 people in Malaysia in concentration camps. A period in which we put, tens of thousands of Kenyans in concentration camps and castrated a number of them for fighting for their independence. It's a period, the kind of bloody wreckage of late British Empire was brutal. And the ceremonial role the Queen played, in effect, was very important in covering up for a lot of that and presenting this sort of, friendly face of this state that could be, I'm sure was personally, in a sense, a bit distant from that. I'm not claiming that she even knew what was going on, but the function of the monarchy in allowing for this kind of cuddly, face of the British state as the state, delivered really serious violence across the world that has often only been uncovered decades later, I think is the one we need to think about. And sure, I'm sure that the Queen has lots of nice thoughts in her mind while that's going on, but that's not the function that the role she was playing had in history. The function was to cover up for really quite violent crimes of empire.
Well, of course, I was born in Australia, and there was, not so long ago, there was an effort to have a referendum. There was a referendum on whether or not to stay with the Queen as a head of state or to become a republic like the United States, and it was voted down. And it's very puzzling to understand why, although perhaps it wasn't well drafted, the referendum. But nevertheless, Australia was started as a dumping ground for British convicts and Irish rebels. And in World War One, the Australians lost more per capita in that war than anybody else, I think, except perhaps the Germans. And then the British hit after the war, and after Gallipoli and all the loss of life, the British hit them with a massive bill to pay for these sacrifices, and the country was in